Welcome back to Radical Engagements, and we finish with Alex Hochuli's breakdown of Vincent Bedman's As We Burn, Chris Catrone's The Death of the Millennial Left, and Jaeger and Borriello's The Populist Moment. Let's go straight into it because there's a lot to discuss, and I've given as much commentary as reading this time. And given that this article has already taken us a good bit of 3 hours, we should probably finish up. The problem of rupture. The left populist gamble may have represented an attempt to seize power, but it also evinced a radical underestimation of power. Yeah. Oh my God, yes, it did. The idea that the center was just as Barn talking, the idea that the center was just breaking, and yet the military and all that stuff was just gonna let it go. The capital is just gonna let things change. That all you needed to do was change the managers, or the main manager in the case of the executive leader. Yeah, that was always going to be a problem. Because while everything looks like Bonapartism, it actually doesn't work that way. And that is something that a lot of people have yet to learn, both on the left and the right, actually. Anyway, back to Hochuli. In the best of cases, less populists took office, yes, but never power. Absolutely. In another ironic reversal, the millennial left dropped the notion of being self-consciously marginal and beginning addressing and seeking to represent basically everyone. But this meant avoiding hard ideological choices. You can't be friends with Eurogroup and the 61% of Greek voters who rejected the memorandum. You can't lead a middle-class metropolitan Remainers and northern working-class Leavers in the UK. Yeah, although, Corbyn didn't really have that many Leavers in the UK in the working class who were supporting him. You can't unify a coalition of college education, woke culturalists, and working-class provincial materialists. What working-class provincial materialists? Simply through the Euro of executive power. Yeah and no. One, a lot of the college-educated people are less culturalist than you lay in on. And it's always college-educated people making this judgment, too. Normal PMC on PMC violence. Which I have always thought is about the shock of self-recognition, and yet also trying to feel like you could do it better if you were in charge. If only there was a better middle-class elite that was more like you. Yeah. But in a real sense, there is a way in which working class people and college educated people cannot be maintained together unless you actually deliver the goods. And I'm not gonna actually even say that you can even talk about working class and college educated as separate like this anymore. Although you will be able to again soon. One of the things that's happening is so many people who are getting jobs out of college that you didn't really need a degree for, or only needed a degree for recently. That's one of the tricks, by the way, when people talk about jobs open to college educated people, is in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, there was an increasing credentialing of positions that did not priorly require any credentialing. Fuck, you could be an actuarial at an insurance company with a high school degree, diploma, in the 60s and 70s. That requires almost a master's degree now. Anyway, but I predict that given that the developed world's population is declining, and a lot of people realize that they're not going to get the jobs that they're getting educated for in the first place, that, and I can see it because I'm a teacher, I can just say it outright, you're going to see a lot of decredentialing anyway. So the current confusion between college educated and kind of like service sector, middle class, and professionals, well, a lot of the professionals are going to move from petite bourgeois into kind of elite wage earners anyway. That's already happening. Christian Parenti has written about it. But on top of that, you're going to just see a massive drop off in people going to college because it's just not as necessary, nor do we need it as an artificial barrier to control the labor market, which is why that developed in the first place. Which I think is a lot more to explain the tensions here between the college-educated, quote, woke culturalist and, quote, provincial materialist, unquote. Although, again, I don't know what that means. The working class in the United States is still slightly more religious than the general population. Although, I mean, that's a relatively new phenomenon. All right. There remains a potentially hostile legislature, a certainly hostile judiciary, a diabolical deep state, and even supranational institutions that will scoop for the best laid plans. Yeah, that's not even mentioning capital flight and the limits of methodological nationalism, the limits of developmental gains with the market the way it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's an overly complex system. The long-term crisis of politics cannot be ignored in the rapid quest for executive power under the illusion that neoliberalism will be swept away with a stroke of a pen. Absolutely, Alex. 100%. Correct, sir. Other ironies abound. Jaeger and Borriello note how technocratic left populism actually was. And yeah, because they lacked the mass membership capable of shaping policy and their voters came from different groups in society with conflicting preferences, like all Bonapartist class collaborationist coalitions, like duh, the left populist parties relied on a technocratic policy fixes to resolve deep contradictions. Yes, they did. But they never even got the chance to implement any of that policy, so we don't even know if it would have worked. But there is a limit to this. How, for example, would one reconcile the urban middle class and the industrial working class attitudes towards climate change? Well, you have to reconcile them. Alex, you don't have a choice. Again, this is one of these things where the democratic principle is how do you address that reality, not whether or not something is actually real. Anyway, investment in one person of Jeremy Corbyn, or more credibly Jean-Luc Mélenchon, for he is much a better orator and tribune, can only go so far. I've not been impressed with any of these figures and don't know why the left still listens to them all. But that's just me. But step back a second. Personalism and technocracy? Is that not essentially Blairism? No, it's not, actually. Like, this attempt to reduce things to forms and then say they're the same thing because they kind of rhyme, this is a tendency that Alex does here that does get on my nerves. I agree with so much of what he's saying, but, like, no, it's not essentially Blairism. It's content, it's different. All right? Like, if I was to say, smokestack socialism is the same as 19th century developmentalism, because they both look like they're about hyper levels of industrialization and ignore what those industrialization was for, I'm basically flattening out key distinctions. Now, sometimes we need to do that, but this is not that time. We don't know what these technocratic policy things would have done. All right. We could talk about personalism and technocracy even in regards to Trump. As much as it doesn't seem like it, Trump still runs a fairly technocratic administration, largely relying on military technology. I mean, what are you talking about here? All right. And so left populism remain, in essence, an urban middle class affair. Yes, I still agree with that. I mean, in France, Mélenchon spoke about conquering the factus mas post factos, angry but not fascist, workers who would not turn irrevocably towards Le Pen's Rassemblement National, but a coalition that never materialized. It continued to rely on urban, highly educated youth and suburban proletariat in the service sector, which, everybody seems to rely on, by the way. Except in the United States, it would be urban proletariat in the service sector. As such, Left populism failed to deliver on its populist unifying promise. The thing is, that can't be unified. That's always going to be the problem. Like, and until you find a way to win over large parts of the petty bourgeoisie or suppress them, which is hard to do in either case, you're kind of stuck. Right, Yeager and Borriello locate the ultimate problem in the fact that the left populists were never able to transform their army of election campaigners into something more durable. Quote, without waging a war of position to consolidate the gains of the digital vanguard, left populism will be remembered as little more than a wasted opportunity, unquote. Had this succeeded, left populisms may not have taken power, not in the short term anyway, but they could have constituted themselves as something of a post-neoliberal force, exerting pressure to change economic policy, as well as going a little way towards mending the secular crisis of politics. Ultimately, the authors conclude the experience was very short-lived, fitting for an ecosystem that is increasingly short-termist and awash with exit options. Well, that's what happens when you rely on individual personalities. A grander play for social transformation is rarely hinted at as a possibility. Yet Yeager and Borriello note that the UK lacked the sort of constitutional barriers that would have held back a coordinated program elsewhere. Asterisk. But you know what Yeager and Borriello don't note is that there's no economy for what Corbynists wanted to do. The 70s industrial economy they want was dependent on the end of empire. That is gone. And one of the deep implications of all of this is just all we need is the will to bring that stuff back. And I don't know if Hochuli believes this, but this has been my critique of both right and left populist nationalism, is because it takes a lot more than just throwing money at the problem. After all, that was the problem with Brexit too, and we'll get to that. And we are aware that Labour suffered a heavy defeat in 2019 after it failed to honor the result of the 2016 Brexit referendum, where was a full-throated denunciation. The authors simply explained that the most remainder activist base mainly knew that British politics is a torture chamber for visceral discipline, not as a site for sovereignty. Yeah, but when has a site for sovereignty ever been good for the left? True though this is, the authors end up somewhere recapitulating the low expectations of the age. Yeah, they do, but it's also true. You can't just hope that that isn't the case. There was no place, no material basis for left Brexit. And unless you believe in a bunch of monetary schemes, well, those monetary schemes work if you're part of the populist core, but Britain opted out of it. All right. The popular appetite for change was there, though, even if the fear of the future always looks around the corner. When people are given the opportunity to reject the status quo, they do, rightly, insists Catrone. The status quo's response is always that they should not have been given the opportunity. Yeah, you hear this a lot. We need to change. We need to save democracy by restoring the status quo in an anti-democratic way. This is increasingly liberals' response. Hence the importance of striking when the iron is hot. Organization, yes, but then some spontaneity. I mean, sure, absolutely. But this is still too abstract. Similarly, Yeager and Borriello observed that the Sanders campaign ended up another quixotic attempt from within the party of capital. Yeah, well, all parties are within the party of capital. There's no party outside capital anymore, unless maybe you can count the PRC or something. But even they're disciplined by the international market. If the failure to break through in Britain concerned the question of the EU, and the United States is about the Democratic Party. To succeed, insists Catrone, Sanders would have needed to run against the Democrats the way Trump had run against Republicans. Would have worked. This part of Catronism has always interested me, because there's a kind of like admiration of right Bonapartism as a spirit of something that is underneath, and not that Catrone's a Trumpist. That's actually not a fair reading of what he has to say, but still, this would have meant challenging the democratic neoliberal combination of capitalist austerity with the new left identity politics of race, gender, sexuality that is the corporate status quo. This, though, would have been a more thoroughgoing populism than what was actually existing left populists ever continents, or if they did consider it, they were dissuaded by the bulk of activists wedded to self-defeating leftism. And again, I think this ignores why this stuff failed in the past. I mean, Catrone loves his linen, but doesn't like to talk about the problems of the national policy. So maybe he does somewhere that I haven't read. Catrone concludes that whatever expectations the millennial left, quote, once fostered were dashed over the course of decades of stunning reversals. This rather overstates how much the millennial left had to lose. Yeah, I kind of agree that they didn't even get that far. Yet it is a historic missed opportunity, but this is more like missing the last bus out of town than getting your car stolen. In an interview with me, Control conceded that the millennial left did the best they could, but crucially, that this was also, could be said of the new left of the 60s and the old left of the 30s. But this is also what the new lefts of the 60s and the old left of the 30s told themselves. And that's true, and they all failed. And they all did the best they could under the conditions they accepted. That last part is crucial. Now, I know that sounds like I'm contradicting myself because I'm saying you can't override like material impossibilities. That's true. You can't change that. But that's not the only conditions these people are accepting. And part of the problem that we have here is a problem of tradition. That leftists do things because leftists have done them in the past, even if there's no evidence that it ever worked. After all, if it had worked, would you be here? Once again, Greece provides the clearest picture of the stakes involved. There were many on the international left who, though lamenting Cyprus' white flag, explained in realist terms that taking Greece off the Eurozone and the EU would have meant utter chaos. Asterisk. I was one of those people, and I still stand by it. However, the chaos that was induced on them by the Troika was so severe that they might as well have done it anyway. You're going to get chaos either way. So might as well take chaos with dignity. Even in a more drawn-out fashion. The crash out would have at least offered Greece a horizon, a possibility to build itself up once again as an independent nation. Maybe. Do you think that the Europe would have let Greece be Cuba? I don't know. And crucially for internationalists, it had the potential to set off a chain reaction. That's a different question. A chain reaction of national sovereignties in which rights could easily take over, or you would devolve into civil wars. And I think that possibility is not dealt with seriously enough in this. But, you know, me and the Off-Bunga crew have often differed on these answers anyway. We'll not get into that. To crash out would have at least given Greece. I've already read that. Nothing of this is certain, absolutely, but at least it would have been a play for greater possibility. Yeah, and which is why I think they should have done it, even though I think that it wouldn't have gone well. But what happened didn't gone well either. So, you know, if your choice is between getting crushed by the Troika or getting crushed by reality, well, at least if getting crushed by reality, you did it on your terms. And maybe those of us could try to help them in another way. Catrone rightly cites Leon Trotsky in saying, those who demand guarantees in advance should in general renounce revolutionary politics. The problem is that most of the millennial left have. Actually, they did for before we even started. And this makes reforms even less likely. Absolutely. The problem of tradition. Catrone, like Jaeger and Borriello, make use of a gambling metaphor. Catrone, however, argues that millennial left chose not to play the hand it was dealt. It shied away in fear from the gamble itself, falling back instead and replaying the cards dealt to previous generations. But what does this mean? This is best explored through references to left-wing political tradition. The thrust of Bevan's analysis of the protests is they were expressive of the legacies of the anti-Stalinist New Left, which I think is a vast oversimplification of the New Left anyway. All right. But nonetheless, cut off from the old left through World War McCarthyism, asterisk, but also the old left's own failure and self-division. Let's not forget the Sino-Soviet split happened, or the Albanian split, or the fact that all the, as I mentioned before, all the total philosophies of Leninism, Trotskyism, Maoism fractured like a motherfucker. That it wasn't just Trotskyism, which everyone makes fun of, but you also see it in Maoism and in classic Marxist-Leninism. They fractured. In fact, the only things that remain relatively consistent were the losers, such as the Council Communists or the Bordigists, who, by not having to play the game, were able to remain somewhat coherent traditions. The result was a rejection of structure and a preference for the prefigurative rather than instrumental politics. The thing is, I think you have to weld the prefigurative and the instrumental together. You have to. There's no way out of that. This is why I don't talk about violence versus non-violence or total abstentionism versus not. These binaries are largely unhelpful. Outside of North America, though, the old left was very much alive, Bevins reminds us, citing Marxist-Leninist parties as well as national developmentalists who often repressed communists, even though they were allied with the USSR. Egypt's Nasser is case in point. Almost all of the Bundang group did that. Almost all of them. This is a false dichotomy. Yes. The legacy of the 1960s runs through both sides. There's a Stalinophobic anti-communism of both the Cold War liberalism and of social democracy, including today's populist attempts to refound social democracy without working-class organization, and a Stalinophilic militancy, Maoism, and Guevarism, asterisks who often end up forming weird sects that can't do anything. Like the Maoism of the militancy and the Maoism in China today of socialism and Chinese characteristics are radically different things. And it's only in people in the developed world being depressed by what the CPUSA or the DSA or any historical party couldn't do that has led them to collapse them all back together again in a way that is historically unfeasible. Let's just pretend the Sino-Soviet split didn't happen while also pretending that that it's clear that one side won it. You can't have it both ways. And yet a lot of the people in the Stalinophilic militancy, including a lot of Trotskyists, I mean, let's not forget that two of the anti-revisionist parties in the United States started off under the tutelage of Sam Marcy, and they were Trotskyist defensist parties. It's funny that these lineages get twisted over time. All right. Setting up a quasi-Stalinist or quasi-Maoist politics as a leftism that works against self-evident failures of anarchist horizonalism is a mistake. Yeah, I mean, because the anarchist horizonalism kind of developed out of the other part. I mean, 1992 fucking happened. It merely results in a sterile and undesirable opposition between two left dead ends, the Stalinist seriousness and organization and the anarcho-liberal narcissism and prefiguration. Indeed, for Catron, what is taken to be left-wing or socialist today is nothing more than the naturalization of the degeneration of the left into resignation and abdication. I mean, sure, but also, like, what does that mean exactly? I often want Catron to nail the specifics to his words, because I often agree with Catron in general, but often don't agree with him in specific. The left takes the product of earlier failures and holds them up as the objects of desire. Absolutely. In fact, we take the entire habitus of failures and naturalize them as an eternal practice. Elements of this are visible in Vebin's commentary on protests. He suggests that the collapse of governments is unlikely in the West, and that the armed forces of NATO countries were certainly not going to abandon the state, nor is NATO going to bomb itself. Absolutely. Is Bevan saying that there's a criterion of success that establishes a separate militarized blocks of nation states making political contestation over a future a geopolitical matter? Asterisk, as like half of people on Twitter seem to fucking think. Asterisk. That would be a rerun of the Cold War. And the Cold War was, in fact, a testament to the failure of global revolution, particularly after in the 1980s, all around the fucking world. Everybody capitulated to the world market to some degree, and the holdouts that did so after they starved for a while. Even Cuba and the DPRK had market liberalizations with at least Russia and China. To the ossification of the struggle for socialism into a mere alternative to capitalism, rather than a more advanced form of civilization. Nevertheless, Bevins indicates radical change is not really possible in the most advanced states and are only possible in the peripheral weak links. Yeah, this is the whole, everyone's a third worldist now because they're not looking at actual third world conditions. This would seem to recapitulate a third worldism that is surely as exhausted as revolutionary politics in the core countries. Yeah, that's because there's not a mass industrial working class in most of the third world either, thanks to automation gains being brought back to the third world. The precariat, and by that we should really mean people who are semi-lumpenized as a verb, is becoming quite a common situation. Nevertheless, Bevins indicates radical change is not really... There is a certain conservatism in this. This is also why Bevins does not deal with the yellow vest in France, who stood out for being the most sustained and proletarian of such protests while also taking place in the core of a capitalist country. It would have been interesting to see this explored. Meanwhile, though Catrone underplays specific problems of organization of our age, yeah, this is something that I get frustrated with him a bit too myself. I'm not saying that he doesn't realize it, he just doesn't see it as important as I do. Specifically, decline of associationisms, i.e. unions, political groups, everything. His essays are useful for urging historical thinking. Millennials blew their chance to relate to history in new ways that challenged and tasked them beyond the post-60s doxa. Yeah. Instead, the millennial left, and both protest and populist faces, evinced a nostalgic quality. Rather than pushing for a New Deal, or much worse, replaying the 60s hippie protests or the 80s resistance to neoliberalism, these practices and beliefs do not augur new possibilities, but hold old memories from a time when many, if not most, were not yet even alive. It is spectral on wheel quality is evident. Yeah, but my challenge to Catrone is Marx actually says that things always start that way. So them starting that way is not the problem; it's them staying that way. And the question is why? Right? That's the fundamental question. I mean, Catrone's right, but read de Brumaire. Marx talks about that in the French Revolution and the English Civil War too. We should be alert to a troubling fact. Over the past 100 years, the left has mostly arrived post festum, certainly in the West, actually all over the world. It plays a role in ushering in a new era, then attacks a new era, and then finally finds it nostalgic for it. Yes. I mean, most leftists today just want their Fordism back. Particularly, whether they're anarcho-liberals or they're people rallying against the PMC, basically what they want is their 1950s back. They're not going to get it. Those material conditions do not exist. They're specific to a time period in history that'll probably never happen again. So the left attacked the stultifying welfare warfare state in the 1960s in the name of individualism, actions which, despite their intentions, laid the groundwork for neoliberalism once the post-war order fell into crisis. See, this is the thing. Did the ideas lay the groundwork, or were they a reflection of the groundwork? Are we idealist or materialist here? Now, there's an interaction. There's a feedback loop here. I'm not saying that ideas don't matter. They absolutely do. The question is, if you have these atomized ideas as a way to return to profitability and a way to bring freedom emerging out of the seeming constraints of Fordism, and both the right and the left simultaneously, and you did. It was not just a left-wing phenomenon. Then why do we think that the 60s protest caused it? They were merely unable to transcend it, and in doing so, fell in with the zeitgeist of the age. The left then set up its stall as the resistance against the reorganization of capital along with neoliberal lines, accompanied by a most forceful, moralized rhetoric in defense of society against individualism. Absolutely. I mean, I agree with Hochuli on almost all this. I just want I want to problematize the idea that it's the ideas alone driving this. It's, it may be that the ideas just they're not good enough. They didn't go deep enough. They didn't look at the various angles deeply enough. And to do that, you really do have to explore all the angles out there, including ones that we do not consider left. Finally, the left finds itself neoliberalism's last defenders in the face of the so-called right populism in the form of Trump, Le Pen, Brexit, Vox, Fratelli d'Italia, or what have you. Well, I mean, that would be like arguing that because Marx was fighting for industrial capitalists to win in the Civil War against whatever the slave states were, that Marx was capitalism's defender, and in a way he was. I mean, I think that irony is fair, but also like it's not new at all. The left may not defend neoliberal policies, but it holds up the neoliberal and neoliberalized organizations and institutions, be it the Democratic Party or the EU or the university or the NGO. And this I agree with Alex on. We have to make our own institutions. All right? That's the only way to counter these other institutions. But we need to be realistic about where those institutions come from. You don't pull a party out of nothing. It has to coalesce out of a bunch of different things. All right. And this is, Communist Communism. In 2011, Colin Crouch's Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism was published. Its central question could still be asked today is both damning of our complacent gerontocratic elites as well as the force of contestation that pushed things forward. Well, the thing is, though, neoliberalism has changed. Both the period of QE, which radically changed the situation after the 2007 Hassen crisis, and in Japan after 2001, and now returning to the late Keynesian interest rate regime as a way of both sucking money out, also pumping money in, because remember, the Fed has to pay that interest out to somebody. It's a very regressive way of pumping money in, too. Well, this really does, this is somewhat new because you are seeing reshoring of industries. The problem is those industries don't employ that many people anymore. See Aaron Beneviev, see Phil Neal, see a lot of people. Indeed, it's the absence of credible popular left that solidifies elite complacency. Yeah, I mean, that's why they're more scared of the right now than the left, for sure. For all the critiques presented here, this should concern those observers who, unlike the present author, has no investment in the left. Why was the left unable to achieve even its reformist goals, let alone any revolutionary dreams that it may have had? A central question raises itself in three eulogies of the millennial left. When politics itself is in crisis, is it necessary for the first step to reconstruct civic organizations as a building block of a credible mass left-wing political party? Yes, I actually believe it is. The question is how. It's not that people did not try. All right. People have been trying to revive the workers' movement as it is right now. And the left is trying to cheerlead itself into doing that now. You see workers' militancy everywhere, but if you look at the numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what you see is that it's a red cream game. People are fighting harder and harder with more and more militancy to stay exactly where they are. That should not surprise us as things get harder. Which means we don't have success, but the militancy is real. So where is this labor movement? Running faster and faster to stay in the same place. Particularly in light of worldwide hostile judiciaries. When politics is itself in crisis, is it necessary for the first step to reconstruct civic organizations to build a credible mass left-wing political party? Or must the left be prepared to act quickly to seize authority and to lead the moments when the masses' conservatism rapidly evaporates and the status quo is rejected, as happens with some frequency, albeit unpredictably, as it happened through the social reforms to the judiciary, actually? Although we over relied on them and set up this current reactionary judiciary regime by doing it. I mean, I would think we have to talk about subjective and objective conditions, which is still kind of vague, but at least that framework from Lenin gives us a way of talking about how there can be a political crisis and a material crisis, but how they cannot be aligned. Like right now, the United States is in a political crisis of legitimacy, period. And yet, it is not really in a material crisis. It's in a material decline, but it's actually doing relatively well considering that decline. It's just most of it's not going to the majority of people. It's stagnation for the great majority of the population. It is. But a bunch of elite people are doing better. Which, given this is a center-left regime, should really concern people. Perhaps it does. But negative partisanship means that we can't ask those questions. And as long as negative partisanship dominates because we're in a political crisis, here we are stuck. We can't respond to the objective material crisis. And I don't think that's unique to the United States, although it might be most severe in the United States because we've been the hegemon for so long. Now that we are not as hegemonic, the quote multipolar world as it exists, we'll see how this all goes. I don't think the multipolarity forgoes any positive or negative conclusion. It will be what is made of it. We should answer these questions with another question already asked earlier. How does political organization enable transformative, emancipatory, and not foreclosing action? The answer, to take our two alternatives above, is surely both. Yes. The millennial failure was to do neither. Also, yes. It was neither able to find the masses to whom it briefly appealed in a new political organization, nor is it able to act and lead in the moment of the crisis, when the destruction of the old order, however conceived, was in shooting distance. Yeah, instead it basically saved it. I mean, I agree with Jaeger and Borriello and Hochuli and Catrone on this. Jaeger and Borriello write that left populist experience failed for being too left, too populist. It failed to break free from its minoritarian left concerns and symbolism, while failing to build a genuine party along old lines, preferring instead the populist gamble. Perhaps another way to frame this is that the millennial left could have benefited from more populist ideology that is not being beholden to the failed modes of left activism of the 20th century or the 19th century, although the 19th century is a better analog for today in some ways, while also being more organizationally conservative. I don't know what that means. This would seem to tally with what Catrone calls a Marxian approach should be able to occupy the vital radical center of political life. Yeah, I mean, one would hope, but it doesn't. And kind of never has. In this U.S. context, this would mean completing the American Revolution, not MAGA, but make America revolutionary again. But the sign of the times of the 2010s has been expressed with the desire to break with the old, a sign the left is too often ignored. Yes, Sanders called for a political revolution in the name of democratic socialism, but what that meant was an electoral shift to support new policies, in a basket of somewhat incoherent ones when you actually looked at them. But reckoning with the crisis of the post-war order and the current crisis of neoliberalism means taking seriously the notion that there is no going back. The end of history is over, and so is the 20th century. Well, the end of history is not yet over. We just want it to be. The atomized individual still dominates, Alex. The thing is, what's the subject? is there even a subject at hand? All in all, 80% good, 20% bad, as the Chinese often say, or what is it, 70% good and 30% bad? I don't know. I think Alex's retrospective on these 3 books actually largely corresponds with my own, with the challenges of what do we mean by this more materially? Can we actually put these ideas in context of their world geopolitical framework in a more nuanced way? And I think everybody's kind of failed to do that. In some ways, people run so thoroughly from economism that they become political determinist, which means voluntarist of a hyper order. And then that flips back into this hyper determinism where everything's just going to go your way just cause. Neither thing is true. Marxists and the left have struggled with this their entire history. We have to answer that question. We need to figure out where we have the power to shift and where we don't. And on that, like and subscribe. Read this article. Go read those books. This article actually got me to pick up the Ben Saveva books because I got so fascinated, disagreed with it so much that I started reading the book. And keep on with the good fight. You need to nail all this stuff down. You need to engage. You need to learn. You need to train. You need to skill. We do it together, or no one does.